When Manaz contacted me about moderating this panel, I became very excited. I'm at the Ford Foundation now, but I spent the greatest part of my professional career at a human rights organization, and my portfolio at Ford involves both domestic women's rights organizations and international women's rights organizations, and it was a way to be more immersed in the conversation about rights than I had been probably in the last couple of years. So I'm excited to be here today, and I'm excited to see a variety of people in the audience, and obviously especially young women. And what is the college that was represented earlier? Salem. I'll have to hear the story of how we have so many Salem College participants in the audience, but it's a very wonderful thing. One of the things that appealed to me about moderating the panel was the questions that the panelists themselves are going to, the areas they're going to cover, and that it brought to mind for me the importance of this ongoing dialogue that I think happens at the individual level, kind of personally. And I liked very much that Joaquin talked about the power dynamic that is in the home and in the world, and that these are actually mirrors of one another. Too often we kind of segregate these issues of power and domination and don't see how pervasive they are in the private and the public spheres, and how mutually reinforcing they are, in fact. So one of the attractive points I think that the panelists will talk about is the universality of rights as a way forward and as a solution that opens possibilities. We are in a world now where the discourse about rights pits universality against a certain, I don't know, individualism or a certain exceptionalism sometimes. And I really do think that a reiteration about the universality of rights as a solution is imperative. And that talking about the universality of rights does not mean the suppression of individual identity, nor the suppression of culture, nor the suppression of religion, whatever one's religion. It doesn't mean an abandonment of who you are. But it does call for then, and it's imperative that there be an actual exploration of what those differences are, that you cannot suppress differences, and that, in fact, there is no need to. It means reclaiming rights and redefining them, and making sure, some of the other speakers have mentioned, that they apply to all in ways that make sense and in ways that, in the final analysis, improve everyone's life. Because rights in theory are almost as good as no rights at all. And on that note, I guess I want to start by introducing our very, very esteemed panelists. And I want to start with my immediate left with Karima Bennoune, who's a professor of law at Rutgers University. She's on the Board of Trustees of the Center for Constitutional Rights and on the council of the Network of Women Living Under Muslim Laws. Her articles are published in many leading academic journals, including the American Journal of International Law, the Columbia Journal of Transnational Law, and the European Journal of International Law. She has served as a consultant on human rights issues for the International Council on Human Rights Policy, the Soros Foundation, and the Coalition to Stop the Use of Child Soldiers. Zaina Anwar is a project director of Musawa for Equal Rights in the Family and the former executive director of Sisters in Islam, a Malaysian NGO that is dedicated to promoting rights within the framework of Islam. She was formerly a member of the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, a chief program officer for the political division of the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, and a senior analyst at the Institute of Strategic and International Studies. She was a political and diplomatic writer for the New Straits Times in Kuala Lumpur. Her book, Islamic Revivalism in Malaysia, Dawah Among the Students, is a standard reference in the study of Islam in Malaysia. So we will begin the panel with comments from Karima.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and many thanks to the organizers for including me. It's really an honor to be here, although it's also very humbling because there are women in the audience whose work has inspired me for years, who are such leaders in this field. And I find it sort of a wonderful honor to be here with younger women who are going to be stepping into the leadership roles in the feminist movement, with women who may have been doing this work a little bit longer than I have, although as I'm getting older, I can say that about fewer and fewer people in the room, but that continuity is very inspiring. It seems to be my job these days to travel around and say politically incorrect things in a variety of settings and offend lots of people, and I'm afraid I may have been assigned that task again this morning. because I have been given the very easy job of telling you everything you always wanted to know about Muslim fundamentalism and human rights, but were afraid to ask, and what this phenomenon means in terms of building a culture of peace, all in about 15 minutes.
Maybe 18.
So please bear with me. There will be many important things I am not able to say here. I know some of you have profound expertise on this issue, and for some of you this may be a very new issue, so I look forward to the discussion. I think I should say first how I came to this subject personally. It was not by choice. It was really by life experience. My father was from Algeria, and I spent my life back and forth between the United States and Algeria. My dad, like many people of his generation in that country, was involved in the nationalist movement, which fought for the independence of Algeria against France, and he ended up spending 4.5 years as a prisoner of war during the War of Independence. After he studied in the United States, he went back to Algeria, the now young, independent country that he had helped to liberate, and became a professor of anthropology at the university. And in the 1990s, in the terrible conflict between the military-backed government on the one hand and the armed fundamentalist groups on the other, he, like so many intellectuals, found himself in the middle. And he finally had to quit teaching at the university and even to flee his home due to death threats from these fundamentalist armed groups, including one that he found on his kitchen table when he came home that said, "Consider yourself dead." His colleagues were in fact slaughtered around him. And I think despite that horror, what was most disheartening to my father, at least it seemed this way to me, was the lack of solidarity that people like him received from the international community. And I think that part of this was due to a lack of understanding of the meaning or meanings of the phenomenon of Muslim fundamentalism, its meanings for many Muslims, and what responses the international community might offer. And so as a result of that personal experience, I have spent a great deal of my time as a professor of international human rights law, researching and writing about this topic, trying to make a small contribution towards perhaps having better responses that are more able to support those people who find themselves today in the same position that my father and his colleagues found themselves in the 1990s, whether it's in Afghanistan, Iraq, Niger, Somalia, Pakistan, or in so many other contexts. And it's for that reason that I wrote my most recent paper, with a very long title. Academics seem to always use those, which is Remembering the Others, Theorizing the Approach of International Law to Muslim Fundamentalism. And I'll try to explain the title a bit as I go along. So what I would like to do in my time this morning is to share some parts of this paper with you, especially some parts, I think, that particularly reflect on women's human rights, and then perhaps conclude with a bit of a, sorry, this is too close, isn't it? Conclude with a bit of a meditation on some of the very difficult events of the last few weeks here in the context in the United States. So I was interested when I looked at a book by very prominent feminist international lawyers, Christine Chinkin and Hilary Charlesworth, written in 2000, that they at that time argued that religious fundamentalisms, note the S, fundamentalisms, are among the most significant challenges to women's human rights, or were at that moment, and I think that remains true. Of course, it's interesting in light of comments at the earlier panel, the other of the two major threats to women's human rights that they identified were indeed the negative consequences of globalization. These two things fit together, certainly. Now, these fundamentalist movements and their adherents often claim to speak for and in the name of the things we call culture, religion, and tradition, and this, I think, raises a particular set of challenges for women's human rights, especially in this moment where, as we've discussed, everything seems to be about identity and certain kinds of identity. Now, what was interesting to me as an international human rights lawyer is, notwithstanding these profound threats to women's human rights, in my field of international human rights law, advocates and academics seem to be very reluctant to engage with these questions. They're somehow taboo. They're uncomfortable. They're embarrassing. We don't want to talk about them. And I wanted to think about why that is so. Now, you begin to see why people don't want to venture onto this terrain, I think, when you see how contested even the words we use to describe the problem, the phenomenon, are. I myself use the term fundamentalism. I recognize that it is not the only term, that it's not an unproblematic term. But why I like the term is that it really speaks across religious boundaries for me about movements within many traditions, Christian, Hindu, Jewish, among others, that are posing a variety of human rights problems. Marieme Eli Lucas, an Algerian sociologist who founded the Network of Women Living Under Muslim Laws, defined fundamentalisms as political movements of the extreme right, which in a context of globalization manipulate religion in order to achieve their political aims. So for me, what I'm talking about here are essentially political movements. They are articulating political aims, but for the most part, exhorting the achievement of those aims using a religious discourse. And the Pakistani post-colonial theorist Saadia Abbas has described this as the radical politicization of theology. Now, contrary to frequent stereotypical assumptions that one hears, sometimes made by people with the best of intentions, this radical politicization that Abbas describes is not necessarily an inherently Muslim approach or one to which Islam or Muslim societies naturally tend. And I think I've been really disturbed about sort of the naturalization of fundamentalism in our discourse about Muslims and Islam often. But I think this is not the only difficult word or the only difficult terminology here, this question of fundamentalism. Another problem is, what do we even call the broader group of people who live on the broader front lines of this discussion and the places they live? I think almost no academic would think of referring to the diverse swath of human civilization from the Americas and beyond as the Christian world. Nevertheless, the terms the Muslim world and the Muslim community have really come to occupy the field here, and this is new. This is a relatively recent development. And I was really interested to read an article by Salah Bashir, who problematizes this term, the Muslim community, as, in his view, a European invention that collapses all of the diversity in a population originating in countries from Indonesia all the way across to Morocco and beyond. This same deconstruction, I think, can be applied to the all too common term, the Muslim world, as well. I mean, I think, in fact, there's some ironic parallels here. This sort of echoes the kind of vision of the Ummah or international community of Muslims that is now, in particular, championed so strongly by fundamentalists. And the use, or the easy use of this terminology, I've begun to describe as kind of the Ummah of the Western imagination. I do think it describes, some reality of some common feeling that some people may have, but it also hides a lot of the complexity. And I'm doing some of that myself today, too, talking about a very specific contextual problem in a very general way in a short space of time. So anyway, the terminology here is very difficult. I will do my best, perhaps using terms like Muslim population instead of community and so on. Now, beyond questions of terminology, just 2 words of history. Fundamentalist movements have proliferated, particularly in recent years, particularly, as was mentioned this morning, since the late 1970s with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. Fundamentalist movements manifest in a variety of ways as everything from non-governmental organizations, that poses some very tricky issues, to sort of political parties, to, at the most extreme end, sort of armed groups. They may, in some instances, such as in Iran, be in government. Often they are found in oppositional roles, such as in Egypt. Some of these movements do not advocate or participate in violence. I need to be very clear about that. Some advocate it, but perhaps do not participate, and some are openly involved in a range of kinds of violence. But I would say that one generalization I could comfortably make about these movements is that they purvey systematic discrimination against women. They may do this in a variety of forms. They may push to further constrain women's rights. They may oppose reforms aimed at advancing women's rights. They did this very much in the Algerian context before the conflict, and they're doing that again now. They may oppose legal advances like the lifting of reservations to human rights treaties that limit women's rights. Some of their action against women's rights is much more overt. They may call for the application of the death penalty for offenses like adultery, and of course we're all following currently the case of Sakina Mohammadi Ashtiani in Iran. They may advocate or in fact participate in attacks on women's human rights defenders, women who work or are otherwise outside the home, women they deem to be insufficiently covered, and so on and so forth. Now, I wish I had lots of time to describe and talk about the root causes of this problem of fundamentalism, and I hope we can talk about that in questions and answers. This did not just descend from the sky. This is a political problem that is a product of a range of both external and internal issues. I can't mention many of them here, globalization certainly, but also internal problems such as lack of religious reform and educational problems and discriminatory attitudes. But certainly one thing Americans need to remember when they think about this is the role of the United States, unfortunately, in promoting fundamentalism in the Muslim world in the context of the Cold War. Certainly the older folks here, we remember this, but the younger folks may not remember as well that in the context of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the United States basically poured money into whatever extreme group, however extreme it was, a jihadist group that was willing to fight the Soviet Union, and pumped huge amounts of money into Afghanistan and Pakistan, and people came from young men, too complicated to sort of explain now, but came from around the world and got trained there and brainwashed there and took that training and that ideology home with them. And that's really how this problem began to metastasize in its most virulent form. And I think that responsibility that the United States bears really means that we have to think very carefully about our policy options in terms of how the United States responds to this issue and our responsibility vis-a-vis those Muslim human rights defenders who are challenging fundamentalist movements. Now, as I said, despite this very significant problem across these different contexts and its consequences for human rights, there's been very little said about this in the field of international human rights law, academic writing. And I think one of the reasons for the anxiety about addressing this issue has been a misreading of these movements as simply cultural, as simply sort of embedded in Islam somehow, rather than as political movements. And of course, this is accepting fundamentalists' own claims at face value. I think part of the underlying problem here has really been international lawyers decreasing confidence in their own assertions about universality, and this speaks to LaShawn's introduction. And I really think in this current moment, fighting for and championing the universality of human rights is absolutely critical to successfully challenging fundamentalist movements and successfully championing the women's human rights defenders who are really on the front lines of this struggle. I think certainly making arguments within a religious paradigm can be a very useful strategy and an important strategy and one that I respect. But I also recognize it as a strategy that, like universality, has its limits. And I think it is utterly vital that we not concede that those called Muslims also have universal human rights. And I think too often that kind of disappears out of the sort of politically correct discussion these days. I need to skip forward here quickly because I really want to talk about the current situation. I think the current moment in the US makes it so difficult to talk about any of this. And I feel the space in which I can sort of live as an academic is really shrinking. So let me just use the rest of the time that I have to talk about sort of where we are right now, at least in my own view. So we recently passed the 9th anniversary of September 11th of 2001, and we find that the international community is still really grappling with the consequences of that terrible day. The armed conflicts which began in the wake of 9/11, whether in Afghanistan or in Iraq, continue. We also see them now spilling over into Pakistan, into Yemen, with devastating consequences for civilians. Human rights abuses in the thing called the War on Terror remain largely unpunished, but will never be forgotten around the world. Xenophobia directed against Muslims serves as a useful tool for right-wing politicians in the United States, and you may, of course, have heard that an idiot in Florida thought he might burn hundreds of Qur'ans, and though he decided not to, he has now inspired copycats around the country. At the same time, we see that Muslim fundamentalist armed movements, akin to those that perpetrated 9/11, like the now various permutations of al-Qaeda, whether in the Maghreb or in Arabia and beyond, as well as the Taliban or al-Shabaab in Somalia or Boko Haram in Nigeria, just to name a few, they too continue to pose major challenges to human rights around the world, and in Muslim-majority societies in particular. These armed movements continue to kill civilians, including many Muslims, who often get much less airtime than other victims. And this we've seen again over the last weekend with the killing of 30 people during the parliamentary elections in Afghanistan on Saturday, and the killing of 36 people in car bombings in Iraq on Sunday. So I'm calling on people in my article to develop a critical analysis of Muslim fundamentalism in my field of international law. How does one do that in this kind of a charged environment? I think it is profoundly difficult, especially in sort of view of the current revival of what I call hatred of Muslims version 20.10, which is clearly something that simply fuels more fundamentalism. I still maintain that offering a critical perspective, even in the United States, on the contemporary problem of Muslim fundamentalism is an essential project, and certainly in my field of international law. In fact, I think the failure of learned U.S. discourse to name and thoughtfully explain the specific political problem of Muslim fundamentalism actually risks facilitating more discrimination against Muslims in general, because it obscures the fact that all of these big issues about terrorism and the war on terror revolve around a very specific set of political actors and politics, not around broader religious denominations or religious claims. Ordinary Muslims or the Muslim religion as a whole must not be confused with specific fundamentalist movements and their adherents, just as most American Christians would not want to be identified with Terry Jones. But the mere critique of Muslim fundamentalist movements themselves is not per se an expression of anti-Muslim bias, and in fact, if done, I think, thoughtfully, is a way of supporting the Muslim human rights defenders who are themselves challenging these movements. In fact, the U.S.'s own national strategy for combating terrorism acknowledges that it is often other people of Muslim heritage who are themselves the primary targets of these fundamentalist movements. In the contemporary period, what we've seen is that U.S. discourse seems to offer two primary choices. There's the openly discriminatory or flawed characterization. Islam is inherently fundamentalist. All Muslims are fundamentalist, and so on. Or the other discourse that is too politically correct to even broach the topic of fundamentalism. And in my view right now, neither one of these is helpful or accurate. And what we actually need is a principled, human rights-based critique of Muslim fundamentalism alongside a principled, human rights-based critique of discrimination against Muslims. To paraphrase a Pakistani colleague of mine, I reject the idea that my choices are limited to accepting either Glenn Beck or the Sharia, and I reserve my right to criticize both of them. Returning to this recent sad anniversary of 9/11, I just want to end by thinking about one of the victims of September 11th of 2001. And of course, we know there are many other atrocities we could talk about as well, but that was also a terrible tragedy in which nearly 3,000 people from 90 countries were killed. And I've thought a lot about one of them lately, and her name was Aminia Rasool. And she was a Guyanan-American Muslim woman who worked on the 95th floor of the World Trade Center. And I read about her in the New York Times Remembrance section. She actually worked on one of the floors, I think, close to where one of the planes hit, so it's truly horrible to think about how she might have died. And it's also compelling to think about the incredible complexity of her life as described by the New York Times, a life which challenged all the simple narratives about what it means to be a Muslim woman in America. She had had an arranged marriage, but according to the New York Times, I can't vouch for this, she and her husband shared domestic tasks. She worked as an accountant by day, but in the evening when her chores were done, she was said to enjoy watching taped soap operas and painting her fingernails. All of these things, whether it's women working outside the home or dramatic entertainment or even the use of cosmetics, are sometimes opposed by Muslim fundamentalists, sometimes even on penalty of death. Meanwhile, many American right-wing racists cannot conceive of a Muslim woman with such a life, nor do those who wave hateful signs in protest against the Muslim Community Center in Lower Manhattan remember Aminia Rasool, even in death. She would have been the other to some of these Americans. But she was also the other for Muslim fundamentalists. And it is this terrible multi-directional dynamic that I was trying to name with this title, Remembering the Other's Others. I'm hoping that women's rights advocates will remember Aminia Rasool when they conceive of what human rights must mean in the post-9/11 era. It means taking violence by non-state actors and states seriously. It means being relentless in demanding accountability for those involved in terrorist atrocities and also for the atrocities of response or the allegedly counter-terrorist atrocities. This means that we have to face up both to the menace of Muslim fundamentalism while and as a means of staunchly defending the human rights of Muslims in the United States. The task of human rights right now, it seems to me, is to try to create an international community that can recognize the complexity of a life story like Aminia Rasool's, and that protects all of the Aminia Rasools of the world from all of the kinds of discrimination and coercion and horror and violence that they can face, whether as women, as Muslims, as immigrants, as Americans, as civilians, as people who live through these categories as overlapping and intersecting rather than opposing. Aminia Rasool left behind 4 children when she was murdered by Al-Qaeda, and let us hope that we can make that better world in their lifetime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, WLP and SAIS, for giving me this opportunity to share the work that my group, Sisters in Islam, does. It's an example that I want to share of a feminist group, a women's group that's basically decided to take the bull by its horn and really engage with religion in the public sphere and creating a public voice and a public space, for women to speak on religion, and the impact of religion and religious laws on women's lives and women's rights. So I am a believing Muslim, and I'm a feminist, and I absolutely do not bellyache over those identities. I have absolutely no problem with identifying myself as a Muslim and as a feminist. But of course, in the context in which we live today, there are many who say that you cannot be a Muslim and be a feminist. That's an oxymoron. In Malaysia, my group, Sisters in Islam, has been at the forefront in creating a public space and a public voice for Muslim women to engage critically and to influence the public discourse on matters of religion and their effects on women's rights and human rights. Based on our research on contentious issues within the community, such as the issue of polygamy, of domestic violence, of women as leaders, women as guardians, women's right to equality and justice, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. We create the space, we write letters to the editor, we issue press statements, we hold press conferences, we conduct campaigns with other women's groups for an end to the use of Islam to justify discrimination against women. We challenge those who claim to have monopoly and authority over matters of religion with a competing vision of Islam, an Islam that is just and compassionate, grounded in contemporary ideals of human rights and gender justice, and the realities of women's lives today in the 21st century. And we do this, and strategically we decided to do this in a very loud and a very public manner, because we don't believe that the kind of change that we want to see in this world is possible by whispering like good Asian women to just whisper in the right ears of powerful men. We need to build public outrage at the injustices committed in the name of Islam, at the defense of patriarchal rulings as God's law, as the authentic Islamic way of life. We need to raise public awareness on the diversity of interpretations and juristic rulings in Islam, and build a public constituency to support a vision of Islam that upholds the principles of equality, justice, freedom, and dignity within a democratic state, not an Islamic state. Of course, this is high-risk business. Like other Muslim women who demand for equality and justice and demand for reform of discriminatory laws and practices, we are told this is God's law, and therefore not open to negotiation and change. To question, challenge, or demand reform will supposedly go against Sharia, weaken our faith in God, and lead us astray from the straight path. So we're often accused of being westernized elites, anti-God, anti-Islam, anti-Sharia, anti-everything. We know women who have deviated from our faith. And reports are made against us to the police, to the religious authorities, to take action against us, to silence us, to charge us for insulting Islam, and to ban our groups. In fact, the first few months of this year, I was telling some of my friends here, was very hard for us, for Sisters in Islam, as over 60 police reports were made against us all over the country. And this was a strategy. I mean, this is a political struggle. This is not about religion, yeah, and faith. Because of the position that we took, a very public position that we took to challenge the decision of a Sharia court to sentence a young woman to 6 lashes of the cane for drinking a glass of beer. Well, these reports, and charges against us are, of course, very distracting to the work that we want to focus on. We actually regard every attack against us as an opportunity to get our voice heard and expand the public space for debate on the role of religion, in our lives. In this light, we also decided to take the government to court last year for banning our book. We had written a book as a collection of conference papers on the impact of Islamic extremism on women's rights. On the grounds, that the government, the religious authorities of the government had banned the book on the grounds that it was a threat to public order, that the thinking in that book that promotes equality and justice un-Islamic and therefore pose a threat, and confuse the Muslims and therefore pose a threat to public order. We were very happy. We had a very good judge. And this year, the judgment came, and the judge overturned the government's decision to ban the book and said that the government could not prove our book would pose a threat to public order, especially when the book had actually been in circulation for 2 years and nothing untoward had happened. So where is the evidence of the threat to public order? The government is appealing against that judgment. The date has not been set. We also have another case against us by a group, Muslim youth group. They call them the Assembly of Muslim Mosque Youth. And they want us to drop the word Islam from our name. Again, the argument is that we're confusing the Ummah, the community of Muslims, by these, deviant ideas, alien ideas of Islam. And our lawyers the case will be heard soon. The case management date has been set, and our lawyers are going to argue that, the case be dropped, as Islam does not belong to any particular group, are exclusive to a particular group of Muslims. So this open contestation within the public space is an important strategy that we've decided to take on, to raise public awareness on the diversity and differences of opinion within Islam and freedom of expression, to test any claims in the name of Islam against the rule of law and constitutional principles of fundamental liberties. I know we come from different backgrounds here. Some of us, like my group, Sisters in Islam, have worked for equality and justice through a rereading of the textual sources of the religion and to unveil an egalitarian interpretation of the sacred text and to ground this understanding of Islam with our constitutional guarantees of equality and non-discrimination, human rights principles and documents that our governments have ratified, and our lived realities. Others have worked strictly within the human rights framework because of the belief that to work with religion, one reason to work with religion where patriarchal interpretations prevail and ijtihad, reinterpretation, is forbidden, is a waste of time. Or that religion, some believe that religion is inherently unjust and unchangeable. As I was often told in the early days of Sisters in Islam, and we've been in this business for some 20 years, attending meetings of women's groups in the region, why do you bother? For every one interpretation you can offer, the mullahs can offer 100 more interpretations. And this is counterproductive because you cannot beat them at their own game. This is their territory in which they are recognized as having the authority to speak on Islam. Why do you enter their territory? But Islam has not gone away from our lives, and we talk about, to this very day. If at all, it has become even more powerful in shaping and influencing the lives of women and the society that we live in today. By ignoring religion, by pretending that it has no role to play in public life, we left the field open to the most conservative and extremist forces within Islam to define, dominate, and set the parameters of what Islam is and what it is not. These people defined for us what Islam means, how to be a Muslim, how to be a good Muslim woman, wife, and daughter, and then prescribe for us laws and rules and policies that keep us women shackled as second-class Muslims and second-class citizens. And then when we protest, they say we have no authority to speak on Islam. But in the context of Malaysia, in a country where Islam is used as a source of law and public policy, we claim that we assert that all citizens have the right to speak on Islam, whether they are Muslims or non-Muslims, whether they're experts or non-experts on Islam. Public law, public policy must by necessity be open to public debate and pass the test of public reason. If the Islamist activists, the fundamentalists, the mullahs do not want us to talk about Islam, then we tell them to please then remove Islam from the public space. And we will all, of course, then shut up because it has no impact on our lives. It's between us and God. Sisters in Islam has been in this struggle for over 2 decades. It is an uphill battle, but it is, I feel, a necessary task to undertake. The work that we do in working on the rights of Muslim women to equality and justice and pushing for a rights-based understanding of Islam that is grounded in constitutional guarantees of equality and non-discrimination. Many constitutions in Muslim countries actually do have a section on fundamental liberties and do provide provision for equality and non-discrimination. Grounded in our constitutional guarantees, in international human rights principles, and in the lived realities of women and men today, the work has had an international impact. And last year, we initiated a global movement called Musawa. It means equality in Arabic, an initiative to build a global movement for equality and justice in the Muslim family. In fact, quite a number of the people here were at that launch in February last year. We brought together some 250 activists and Islamic scholars to Kuala Lumpur to be part of what we hope to be a very visible national, regional, and international presence of a movement led by Muslim women demanding equality and justice in Islam and demanding that Islam should not be used to discriminate against women in law and public policy and in practice. What Musawa hopes to bring to the larger women's and human rights movement is this: an assertion that Islam can be a source of empowerment, not a source of oppression and discrimination, an effort to open new horizons for rethinking the relationship between human rights, equality and justice, and Islam, an offer to open a new constructive dialogue where religion is no longer an obstacle to equality for women, but can be a source for liberation, a collective strength of conviction and courage to stop governments and patriarchal authorities and ideological non-state actors from the convenience of using religion and the word of God to silence our demands for equality, and a space where activists, scholars, decision makers working within the human rights or the Islamic framework or both, can interact and mutually strengthen our common pursuit of equality and justice. Our activities are currently focused on 3 areas of work: knowledge building, international advocacy, and outreach to build a movement in different parts of the Muslim world, and also in minority Muslim contexts in the West, where Muslim women are similarly affected by the rise of religious fundamentalism and the attempts to impose Islamic law, Sharia tribunals to govern the personal status of Muslim women in the West. We have produced 3 publications, and please go to the website if you're interested, which laid the foundation for Musawa as a knowledge building movement. A book called Wanted, Equality and Justice in the Muslim Family. It's a book of analytical papers that seek to understand the genesis of Muslim family law, how it was constructed within the classical faith tradition, and how the wealth of resources within Islamic jurisprudence, Quranic verses on justice, compassion, and equality can actually support reform towards a more egalitarian family. We're also building a resource-rich website to promote the principles of Musawa and the substantive arguments for family law reform using the holistic 4-prong approach that I keep mentioning. How do we justify equality and non-discrimination at the Islamic, constitutional, human rights, and lived realities levels? And for this approach, we really owe a debt to Mahnaz and to the Women's Learning Partnership for translating into English the work of the Maghrib 95 group and their guide to equality. And also, of course, to our friends in ADFM Morocco, which is also a WLP partner, who have shared with us their strategies and experience at many meetings. We don't claim to have all the answers or that our strategy is the best strategy, but we feel that it is important that we tell those who use religion to sustain patriarchy and justify discriminatory laws and practices against women that enough is enough. You don't have the monopoly over the discourse on religion. For me, the hope for change lies in the growing voices of dissent against intolerant, oppressive, and discriminatory teachings of the religion, the opening up of the public space, and the breakdown in the monopoly that the traditional religious authorities have over the discourse on Islam. Therefore, the democratization project in Muslim countries today must go hand in hand with the debate on the public role of Islam. The Islamist opposition cannot demand for more democracy, justice, and respect for human rights on the one hand, in order to get rid of an authoritarian secular government, but at the same time demand that all these principles stop at the door of Islam. That somehow Islamic law and policies should not be put to the same test that they demand of the despotic ruler. Public law, as I said, must be open to public debate. And even if that law is made in the name of religion, it is no longer tenable to hide behind the sanctity of the divine to silence dissent and to erase differences. The challenge then in many Muslim countries is to expand this public space, to open up the debate, to turn the dissenting voices into a clamor for justice and equality, for freedom and dignity at the national, regional, and international levels. And women's groups in Muslim countries have been organizing and building bridges across regions to multiply their voices, to take the lead in reforming the teachings and understanding of Islam, to deal with the challenges of the modern world and the realities of our lives today. How we live our faith in this world remains a work in progress. And for me, actually, it's an exciting work in progress. The challenge is not just for Muslims, but also for Christians, Jews, Hindus, Buddhists. That there is a resurgence of faith in public life is obvious. There is a yearning for transcendence, for spirituality, for faith in an age of rapid change, and all the uncertainties and fears of the unknown that change brings. As a Muslim, I do not believe that a simplistic call to return to an idealized golden age of Islam that has little bearing to the realities of today's world can be the answer. Neither is the wishful thinking to will religion away from the lives of Muslims. The critical and systematic engagement with the religious tradition begun by feminist scholars and activists has actually opened up spaces within Muslim societies for an alternative discourse to emerge, to challenge and to delegitimize the discourse of patriarchy as inherently Islamic. This serious, critical, and thoughtful engagement with the religion in a political agenda that seeks gender justice is a work in progress. As a Muslim feminist in the 21st century, I'm excited by this emerging paradigm shift that in Muslim theological and jurisprudential scholarship, that I can see this in my lifetime, that I will see the possibility of reconciling the teachings of Islam with human rights, with women's rights, and that Muslims caught in the debilitating identity politics of our times do not have to choose between being a Muslim or a feminist. That indeed you can be a Muslim, a feminist, and actually have fun as well and be fully engaged in this modern world. Thank you.
Karima, I wanted to start with you. I'm very interested in this idea that there's been a certain level of self-censure among academics or even practitioners of international human rights law, and that there has been a certain cowering with regard to calling things what they are. And I'm interested in kind of your assessment of why that's happening, and what some solutions might be to the dual challenges of identifying human rights violations as human rights violations, and nevertheless not demonizing entire communities or entire religions, because that is potentially the flip side of that, and what you alluded to, or what you said earlier when you said that it was absolutely necessary to continue defending the rights of all people, including Muslims in this country and other places. And Zaina, I wanted to get to a core element of your argument, which was that, and there's been lots of discussion of this of late, kind of reclaiming Islam and ensuring that there is a challenging of interpretation, and that I think your words were that it gets reread and reinterpreted texts so as to unveil the egalitarian interpretations and outcomes of Islamic law. And I'm wondering, both in the context of Malaysia, but also outside of Malaysia, whether your argument is in part predicated on a certain role of civil society, a certain, if not leniency, a certain acceptability of the government to engage civil society in a way that would not endanger someone's life in raising these questions, since we do have lots of countries where the very idea of reinterpretation is heretical and can land one in jail. So the example of Malaysia, and where else you see there might be challenges to that because of actually the absence of a civil society discourse with government, and a government that is in fact accountable and that will not respond with violence that would, behead the entire movement, literally if not figuratively. Whoever wants to go first.
This is why I think it's really important, to recognize the importance. That this work can really only thrive within a democratic culture. That without that democratic culture, it's very hard. Where is the space, for differences and diversity and challenging voices? We heard this in the earlier panel. Where governments, with the rise of Islamic political Islam, governments use religion, use culture. At their convenience to maintain hegemony and control, and that includes control over women's lives. But, in our context, I know it's easier said than done, but really, that change, the government is not going to deliver democracy, on a silver tray. It's really, up to us, citizens, civil society, to fight. And in all Muslim contexts, you find that, people organizing, NGOs organizing in order to bring about change. And you have to take risks. When we decided to do this, everybody, says that, that you're very courageous to do this. But courage was really not an issue. It's really outrage. That was, the outrage that, because we've been brought up, in Malaysia, Muslims, we go to religious, and I go to regular school, but I also go to religious school. So I've been brought up with religion, with the idea that God is just, with the idea that Islam is just. And that's why I really have no problems in being a feminist and a Muslim. I don't have that conflicting identity that some others do. But, with the rise of political Islam, and suddenly, all these injustices and, are justified in the name of Islam. And in order to silence women's demand for change, women's demands for equality and justice, then you have to take that risk, in deciding that in order to bring, in a society where religion is a source of law and public policy, in a society where religion plays an important role in the lives of women, and in a society where women are discriminated against and Islam is used, to justify that, then it is important to begin to open up that space to engage with the religion. And you have to take risk, we've been in this work for 20 years and we still get police reports lodged against us, attempts to silence us, court cases against us. But actually, for us really, that actually is an opportunity for that alternative voice and that alternative discourse and that battle to be engaged in the public space. And it actually opens up opportunities, for more diverse voices. So even if we lose a court case, when we decided to take the government to court, we decided even if we lose that court case, it does not matter. Because then the arguments is about getting the arguments on freedom of expression, on diversity and differences, out there in the public space, in particular to educate the Muslim public constituency that there are differences within Islam. And that the decision that the government takes is a political decision, which interpretation, which understanding of Islam that it wants to take as a public policy and a public position. It is not an Islamic divine position, but it is a political position. And that is what we're trying to engage in the public space, to realize that this is the political project, that knowledge is human constructed, is not divine, and therefore necessarily it has to change with changing times.
So thank you for asking me that question, which gives me a chance to say a few of the things that I didn't get to. Why do I think there is what I argue to be a certain silence among sort of human rights academics about this topic at the moment? Just to give you an example of the kind of silence that I mean, if you look at the sort of output of international human rights lawyers in recent years, you will find a huge amount of completely justified critique of the conduct of what I guess we now have to call the phenomenon formerly known as the War on Terror. But what you will not find is sort of the analysis of the quote-unquote other side of that quote-unquote war. And I have been left wondering how useful our critique of a response to a phenomenon that we're not analyzing ultimately is going to be. I think there are a number of reasons for this. One I already mentioned. I think it has to do with our nervousness about universality and decreasing confidence in universality. I think there's been some justified critique of hegemony masquerading as universality, but I think the response to that ought to be really to reclaim a vigorous, truly universal universality rather than sort of throwing it out the window. I also think that it's about the very thin discourses of victimhood that we have tended to have in human rights, where we like to have pure, innocent victims. And we struggle with people who may be in one context victims and in another context perhaps perpetrators. And I think this came up around some of the terrible abuses that were committed against people, either who were in fact Muslim fundamentalists or who were sort of wrongly suspected of being, and the way in which those people were defended. And I think it's not just human rights theory, it's also human rights practice. So if you look at some of the biggest controversies recently in the human rights world, one had to do with Amnesty International recently firing the head of its gender unit, who's a very prominent Indian feminist, Geeta Sahgal, for whom I have a lot of respect. And Geeta got fired because she publicly criticized the organization for its overly close relationship to a former Guantanamo detainee of British nationality named Muazzam Beg. Now, Geeta Sahgal was the first one to say that when Mr. Beg was being arbitrarily detained by the United States authorities in Guantanamo, and he alleges that he was tortured, that Amnesty International was absolutely right to defend his rights. The problem was when he got out of detention and came back to Britain, he became a huge human rights celebrity in a narrative which completely disappeared his own track record of being in and out of jihadi training camps, of working in the milieu of extremist bookshops in England, which are the organizing forum for jihadi movements there. And he was invited actually to keynote an Amnesty International annual general meeting, and it said in the program, I consider myself left-wing on equality, but conservative on family values. And there was no comment on this. And I thought, if he had said, I'm left-wing on equality, but conservative on race relations, would we have invited him to keynote this annual general meeting? In any case, I think there was a desperate desire to make him some sort of innocent, pure victim, as if only those people deserve human rights. And indeed, that again goes back to the universality of human rights, but we have to get into complexity. We're not living in an easy black and white world anymore. And I love the work of an Algerian woman activist, Sharifa Khader, who founded an association of Algerian victims of fundamentalist terrorism named Jazairuna, which means Our Algeria. And she is incredibly principled. She actually spoke out against an amnesty that was given both to the perpetrators that acted on behalf of the state and the perpetrators that acted on behalf of the armed fundamentalist groups. And so after sort of risking her life standing up to the fundamentalists, she then was kicked out of her government housing. It's that kind of complexity, having to be multi-directional. It's messy. It's very difficult. And I think it gets us beyond some simple human rights narratives that we've had, where we've wanted to know right and wrong rather than struggle with kind of competing difficulties. And I think that's a big piece of the answer. I think this goes back to something Francis Kissling said this morning about being very careful about getting caught in a dynamic of response. And I think that's a lot of what has happened in recent years. We're stuck in this sort of, either it's the thesis or the antithesis, and I think we need to get back more and more to the synthesis place.